Okay, hi, would you ever want to or be willing to do an informational type interview on stream? We've talked a bit about your history and how you got to your point as a psychiatrist, but I, and probably other people, have several questions on what led you to your path, why the medical field, why a psychiatrist over a psychologist, thoughts on psychotherapy versus medication, what factors do you think led you to being accepted to medical school? Yeah, so I can talk about that now. So it sounds like people are interested in my bio, in my background, what led me to my path. So I'll start, and there are a couple of, so the question is, what led me to my path? Why the medical field? Why a psychiatrist over a psychologist? Thoughts on psychotherapy versus medication? What factors led you to think, you think led you to being accepted into medical school? So let's start with, let's just start with the first question, okay? So how did I get here? So I think my journey starts with playing a bunch of video. Actually, I mean, if you guys really want to get into it, I think my journey starts with playing video games because I was a year ahead. So I went to this very small school that had a very high teacher to student ratio. And so in the span of being in that school for 2 years, I basically skipped a grade. And so then what happened is I entered the first grade as a 5-year-old. And, or 6-year-old, I guess, or second grade as a 6-year-old or something like that. I was 1 year younger than all of my classmates. And so the first thing that happened is I sucked at sports because I was a 5-year-old competing against 6-year-olds. And if you think about that, a 5-year-old is just not going to compete on any level with 6-year-olds. And, so I think that, what happened is I started off being bad at sports, and then I gravitated towards video games because at video games I could be just as good as my colleagues. And the reason that I started to believe I was bad at sports and I was unathletic, but the truth was I was just a year younger. So there's no way that a 5-year-old is going to be able to run as fast as a 6-year-old. 6-year-olds are OP, absolutely correct. Unless you're a 6-year-old competing against 7-year-olds. And then, so I started playing a lot of video games, and then started to sort of become directionless, fall behind, had a bunch of ego and stuff like that in high school. And then basically was failing out of college, and then ended up going to India at the age of 21 because my life was going nowhere. I had less than a 2.0 GPA, was failing, all that good stuff. And when I was in India, discovered yoga and meditation and really loved it. So I loved that, so we study stuff, right? We study mathematics and we study science and we study neuroscience and we study economics and sociology and psychology. And we formally sit down and say, I can get mastery over this field of the world if I sit down and systematically learn it. What I found with yoga and meditation and Ayurveda was a system to understand myself in a methodical way. That I can sit down and study who I am and how I work as a person, and then I can get better at being me. And I love that. I found answers to so many questions, everything that we're talking about on stream, these urges that we have, I feel like cleaning more after I clean, how does that work? There's a principle under which that works. Why you feel like cleaning, why you feel ashamed, why you want to ask someone out, why you can't ask someone out, why you play video games, why you can't stop playing video games, why you can't, start writing a 10-page paper, why you can't approach reading a really long textbook. This is all random crap, but there's a system to understand how all of it works, right? This is the system of understanding a human being, which is literally what yoga is. Yoga is about understanding, not asana, which is what they do at yoga studios, but true yoga. In its original form, in its truest form, which didn't really get translated over to the West, didn't really cross the pond, mostly stayed in India, is about understanding how a human being works. Because there are laws and principles that govern your physiology, your neuroscience, psychology, right? And so then, getting back to my life, so I was okay, this is really cool that I'm learning all this stuff from a yogic perspective, but I'm a skeptic by nature and I like references. So I'm going to understand the science. So I became a researcher. As I started to have experiences in meditation that were super trippy and really cool, I was like, what the F is going on in my brain during these times? Like, I have a brain, like, how does that work? So I started off doing EEG studies on meditators. So this is measuring the electrical activity in the brain during meditation. And I was like, that's pretty cool. I liked that. And then I started doing neuroscience research. I did that for a couple of years. And then I decided that like I wasn't going to become a monk because I met my wife, fell in love, etc. And so then I was like, well, I have to do something. So what do I want to do? And I decided to become a doctor for a couple of reasons. The truest reason I became a doctor is because one of my teachers told me that unless you can succeed in the material world, you're not going to succeed in the spiritual world. Because anything you do in the material world is going to be way easier than what you do in the spiritual world. Because the real world is like for noobs, and the spiritual world is for experts. Pros go to the spiritual world. That's what he told me. So I was like, okay, fuck it. I'm going to just set a goal for myself. And it was kind of arbitrary, to be completely honest. It was really somewhat arbitrary. I was like, I'm going to become a doctor. Just because it's hard. Because it's hard. And I have a 2.5 GPA. And so that seems impossible. So I'm going to do that. Because if I can do that, then I'm going to succeed in meditation. That's literally how it worked. And then there were a couple of other factors. So one was that while I loved kind of psychology in the mind, I didn't. So Ayurveda doesn't separate different fields of medicine. Like they don't think that you don't have a psychiatrist and a cardiologist. You have one person who does everything. And the reason that they do everything, they specialize more in terms of methods, but not like organs. And so, what I liked about, so I just didn't believe that, like, you can understand the mind without understanding the body. And that's why I decided to become a psychiatrist instead of a psychologist. Sort of. It's kind of like, it's not quite like that because the order of operations was a little bit different, but that's why I like becoming a medical doctor and I didn't shift gears because I wanted to understand the body as well as the mind. And I know that psychologists don't get a lot of bodily training, and I know that that's kind of how our system works, but I think a lot of emerging evidence around like brain-gut stuff clearly demonstrates that there's a link between the body and the mind. And ultimately, at the end of the day, I feel like if you don't understand the body, you're depriving yourself of a lot of tools to help the mind. That's just a fact. It doesn't mean that psychologists aren't good at what they do. It doesn't mean that they can't do a wonderful job. It's just, in my opinion, I wanted to understand it all. Like, I like understanding spirituality. I like understanding neuroscience. I like understanding everything. I don't like understanding just one part of something. Like, that feels incomplete to me. So it's fine to have a trippy experience in meditation. What's it doing to my brain? I want to know that neuroscientifically. I want to understand how things work. That's why I decided to become a psychiatrist, sort of. When I went to medical school, it was still sort of this idea of like, okay, I'm just going to like set a target and it's going to be kind of arbitrary. So I actually decided to become a oncologist first and then switch to psychiatry in my 4th year. How do we fix brain gut stuff? We'll talk. So I decided to become a psychiatrist actually in my 4th year because I realized that, like, actually, I don't know why I didn't realize this sooner, but I actually really like the mind, and that's always been what's interested in me, so I decided to do psychiatry. But I had some thoughts that psychiatrists aren't real doctors and all that good stuff, because, like, my dad was an oncologist, and I sort of idealized him and things like that, and, like, I wanted to be a real doctor, because I still had a lot of ego, right? So I wanted to be someone that saves lives, and, like, treats heart attacks, and, like, I'm gonna cure cancer. I'm gonna be a surgeon. So I was, like, debating becoming a trauma surgeon for a little while. And was like leaning towards oncology because I wanted to be like a holistic cancer doctor and use like herbs and like, treat cancer and then like teach them yoga and teach them how to meditate and like help them become like connected with their spirituality before they die and like all this good stuff. So that's kind of how I became a psychiatrist.